Thank you. Let me, first of all, thank the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences for organizing this inspiring meeting, and personally, let me thank Monsignor Sanchez Sorondo for this initiative. I'm here as an Italian judge, but also in my capacity as the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking Persons, especially women and children. I had the privilege to participate 2 days ago in a briefing of the Security Council in New York, and to brief the Security Council about the linkage between trafficking in persons and conflict. The open session was devoted to the linkage between sexual violence and trafficking and conflicts. And in fact, it is the first time following the US presidential declaration of December 2015 that the Security Council established an agenda concerning trafficking in persons. And of course, the linkage between trafficking and conflict has been so far largely overlooked. But recent reports, such as those published by the International Organization for Migration and Caritas Internationalis, show that trafficking is not something like a mere possibility, a mere possible outcome of a conflict, but is associated with conflict on a regular basis. Why? Because, of course, of the collapse of the rule of law, because of instability, displacement, all the vulnerabilities of minority groups, for example, of women and children, are exacerbated. New vulnerabilities emerge. So what we observe is that trafficking is a consequence of conflict in conflict areas. Regarding people fleeing conflicts, and I will touch upon this issue in particular during my intervention, and in post-conflict situations. Of course, one recent pattern has been particularly discussed in the context of the Security Council, which is the pattern of abductions for their homes or schools of women and girls who are subsequently forced to marry and or serve as sex slaves. Such exploitation, which in some cases involves trafficking for forced marriage and sexual enslavement by extremist groups such as ISIL, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates, is believed to be a strategy to generate revenue as well as to recruit, reward, and retain fighters. In addition, the journey of female migrants and unaccompanied children traveling through the Horn of Africa is particularly hazardous. Thousands have disappeared, presumably abducted for purposes of exploitation, including sexual exploitation. In other words, sexual exploitation, sexual slavery, and trafficking, in addition to being gross human rights violations, have become a tactic of war and terrorism. Trafficking is linked with conflicts in innumerable ways. And in all these circumstances, it is imperative to protect victims and end impunity. Both goals should be, on equal foot, important. Children, first of all, children are trafficked into military service, and especially girls are used as sexual slaves for fighters. Secondly, peacekeeping operations, unfortunately, continue to be the occasion for shameful incidents of sexual violent abuse and exploitation, which undermines their vital role in protecting communities, including women and children, from violence and exploitation that is common in post-conflict situations. Thirdly, trafficking of migrant workers into conflict zones for the purpose of labor exploitation is so far a completely hidden issue. While not all cases of contracting and subcontracting involve trafficking for labor exploitation, there have been cases where large firms that hold the prime contract with states and their militaries hire migrant workers through smaller subcontractors or local employment agencies to perform tasks including cleaning, construction, cooking, and serving. Exploitative recruitment of South Asian migrant workers to provide service at military work sites of conflict areas in the Middle East has been detected. The subcontractor deceives workers about the place of the post, about the type of the work, and people get trapped in containers working in conditions of forced labor. Persons fleeing conflict could also be vulnerable to trafficking for purpose of organ removal. There was evidence that migrants fleeing conflict in the Sudan were being targeted for organ harvesting in Egypt. But I would like to mention in particular the situation of people fleeing conflict zones. Lack of access to safe and legal migration options forces many persons fleeing conflict to use the services of illegal facilitators, increasing their exposure to exploitation, including trafficking. For the millions of people who are forced to flee their country because of armed conflict, the journey of escape has become increasingly expensive and hazardous, as Giovanni Salvi explained. The Syrian conflict in particular is causing a massive exodus that should be seen as a global humanitarian crisis. And when I say crisis, I don't mean that it is a contingent phenomenon. It will last, unfortunately, and it is a crisis, though, because that requires a shared responsibility approach, which unfortunately is not there so far. It is appalling to see a complete lack of empathy, solidarity, or even human compassion in the public discourse of so many politicians and in the reactions of certain areas of the public opinion in European countries. We hear about walls and closed borders, and this means that there is no hope for people who are actually forced to leave their homes and put at risk their lives and the lives of their children in the search for security and survival. Hundreds of people, including so many children, have already lost their lives in the Mediterranean Sea, and others are at risk of losing their lives, maybe in this very moment. For those surviving their perilous journey, there is a tangible risk of trafficking-related exploitation. Throughout their journey and at their destination, migrants, including refugees and asylum seekers who have sold all their possession to pay for their travel, are highly vulnerable to physical violence, sexual assault, extortion, and trafficking. For exploitation, for any forms of exploitation, sometimes extreme forms of exploitation in slavery-like conditions. And I would like to say that this is not something different from the subjects we are discussing today. Victims, those we encounter in prosecutors' offices and in courtrooms, maybe have this personal background. More and more will have this background of persecutions, displacement, bombing, torture. And we have to be, as prosecutors and judges, aware of this. Let me say that as judges, we are discussing this issue in a very worrying context, in a context in which, at the European and at the global level, all the statistics, the sources indicate a decrease of prosecutions and convictions, and even more of convictions. So we have to discuss and establish among each other what can we do? What can we do better? What can we do more? And from this point of view, let me address you with a few recommendations coming from 20 years of experience in the prevention and fight against trafficking in human beings. First, I think that we should be aware, Corinne Detmeyer touched upon this issue during her intervention yesterday. We should be aware that trafficking is a social and economic global issue, especially in its labor dimension, which is growing, involving enormous economic interests, in addition to being a criminal issue and an organized crime issue. And this issue is deeply linked with migration. The effectiveness of the criminal justice response, and in Italy we know that from the rich experience of combating the mafia and organized crime that has been evoked by my colleagues before me, we know that the effectiveness of the fight against organized crime depends, among other things, on a correct perception of the social features and implications of the crime. Without this kind of awareness, we cannot understand, for instance, the personal background of a victim. We could misinterpret grossly their behavior and consider as a consensual situation a relationship between the victim and the trafficker, which on the contrary is based on abuse. For example, the fact that exploited workers consider their exploiters as someone helping them to survive and avoid deportation. From this point of view, I would like to say that when we go back home, we have a precise task, the task to spread what we have learned today in terms of knowledge of the complex features of this crime. Second, we judges have a legal obligation to interpret national law in the light of international instruments and international case law. In any country I visited, or otherwise I'm aware of, a number of judgments are, legally speaking, wrong, especially taking into account the most recent evolution of international jurisprudence. I talk about judgments based on a narrow criteria of interpretation, denying the legal qualification of slavery or trafficking because the victim was not completely deprived from their freedom of movement, or because the victim had initially consented to illegal migration. Correct criteria of interpretation should be the subject of training and awareness-raising activities by national judicial councils, judges' associations, national rapporteurs, as Corinne Detmeyer does on a regular basis in her elegant and firm way. Criminal proceedings is often the only opportunity to put in place protective measures for victims. It shouldn't be like this, as assistance and support should be unconditionally provided to trafficked persons. It is like this, it is provided for by the EU 2011 Directive and the Council of Europe Convention. However, as a matter of fact, in the vast majority of countries, assistance and support is made conditional to a victim's reporting to the police or acting as a witness. We should be aware, especially prosecutors, that it is our duty to ensure the respect of victims' rights, not only within the criminal proceedings, but also from a social point of view. In this respect, I suggest looking better into the Italian practice of memoranda of understanding between anti-mafia prosecutors' offices, the police, and NGOs providing assistance to victims, in order to coordinate actions aimed at effectively accompanying victims in their recovery and reintegration process. And from this point of view, I would like to pay tribute to the National Anti-Mafia Directorate for its leading role during many years. 4, go after money. Seize and confiscate money is the most effective deterrence measure when we talk about organized crime, and it's also a means to ensure compensation to trafficked persons. Trafficked persons need a further chance to rebuild their lives. This means that financial investigation should be used from the very beginning of any investigation regarding a potential trafficking case, especially regarding labor exploitation. In this field, we have to bear in mind that not only should criminal intermediaries be tackled, but also employers should be accurately scrutinized when they are the final beneficiary of forced labor and trafficking. There is a long way to go. Numbers are, frankly speaking, depressive concerning criminal proceedings and the number of victims assisted. In this long way, as in the case of historical slavery, we need to mobilize legal but also moral resources. The inspiring leadership of Papa Francesco gives us hope that people of goodwill will be able to join efforts on the basis of a religious or secular approach to restore human rights, human dignity, and social justice. Thank you.